The Apocalypse Tourist. Humanity had always been captivated by endings, moments when the great tapestries of civilization unraveled into silence. Ancient ruins, extinction events, the collapses of empires. These were tales that echoed through generations. They were studied, mourned, and in the modern era, commodified. The rise of temporal tourism brought with it opportunities to do more than read about the past. It allowed people to witness history as it happened, and sometimes as it ended. The pinnacle of this morbid fascination was Apocalypto Experiences, a company whose tagline was simple yet audacious. See the end, live the unforgettable. Unlike other time travel firms that offered historical sightseeing tours to monumental events like the signing of the Declaration of Independence or Shakespeare's premiere performances, Apocalypto specialized in endings. They provided their elite clientele with front-row seats to the downfall of civilizations, including the fall of the Mayans, the sacking of Constantinople, and the volcanic annihilation of Pompeii. Their latest venture, however, was a leap into uncharted territory, an expedition to humanity's own end. This time, the journey was not backward but forward, to the year 3021, a point in time meticulously calculated to mark the definitive extinction of human civilization. The promotional materials promised an experience like no other, an unflinching look at the apocalyptic future where the last remnants of human achievement drowned under a toxic, endless ocean. Witness the final chapter of mankind, they declared. It was a challenge few could resist. Among those few was Leonard Bishop, a historian with an insatiable appetite for answers. For years, Leonard had been drawn to theories of societal collapse, poring over texts and artifacts in search of patterns. He had become obsessed with the idea that human history operated in cycles, doomed to repeat itself unless understood and interrupted. The opportunity to observe the apocalypse firsthand was, to him, a once-in-a-lifetime chance to confirm his theories, and perhaps find a way to avert humanity's ultimate fate. The journey to 3021 required rigorous preparation. Apocalypto's technicians emphasized the importance of the suits, which served as both protective barriers and stabilizers in the chaotic temporal environment of the future. Leonard and his 6 fellow travelers were briefed repeatedly on the rules. Do not interact with the environment. Do not stray from the group. You are observers, not participants. The stakes were clear. Any deviation could destabilize the timeline and, potentially, the travelers themselves. On the day of departure, Leonard stood in Apocalypto's Alpine facility, gazing at the massive temporal aperture. The portal hummed with an unstable energy, its swirling edges glowing in colors that defied description. The room was filled with a palpable tension, a mix of excitement and unease. As the countdown began, Leonard tightened his grip on his helmet, bracing himself for the leap into the unknown. The activation of the portal was unlike anything Leonard had ever experienced. The sensation was one of complete disassembly, every atom of his being deconstructed and hurled through a tunnel of light and sound before being reassembled on the other side. When he opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was water. Endless, dark water. The scene before him was breathtaking in its desolation. Submerged skyscrapers jutted out of the ocean like the bones of a forgotten giant, their skeletal remains draped in seaweed and encrusted with coral. Lightning crackled across the perpetually stormy sky, illuminating the ruins in brief, brilliant flashes. The air smelled acrid, metallic, and Leonard's suit emitted a soft chime as it adjusted the filtration system to make it breathable. The sound of the waves crashing against the ruins was eerily soothing, masking the underlying sense of danger. The chronologists leading the expedition began their narration, pointing out key features of the landscape. They identified the submerged remnants of a once great metropolis, speculating on its identity based on the faint outlines of ancient landmarks. This could have been New York, one of them said, their voice tinged with awe. Or perhaps Tokyo. The records from this era are fragmentary at best. Leonard listened, but his focus was elsewhere. He felt drawn to the ruins, to the secrets they held. While the group moved as instructed along the designated observation route, Leonard's curiosity got the better of him. He noticed a structure partially exposed above the waterline, a building whose walls shimmered with an unnatural glow. Without alerting the others, he veered off course, carefully navigating the unstable terrain. The closer he got to the building, the more he felt a strange pull, as if the air itself was urging him forward. The walls were covered in symbols, intricate, glowing patterns that seemed alive, shifting and changing as he moved. Leonard reached out to touch them, and a low hum vibrated through the structure. It was a sound he felt more than heard, resonating deep in his chest. At the center of the chamber, Leonard found it, a sphere floating just above the ground, pulsating with a silvery light. He approached cautiously, captivated by its ethereal beauty. The liquid inside swirled in hypnotic patterns, and as Leonard stared into it, the patterns began to shift. Images emerged, cities collapsing, skies ablaze, oceans swallowing continents. Each scene was more devastating than the last, yet he couldn't look away. And then he saw himself. In the heart of the destruction, Leonard stood, holding the sphere. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. He wasn't just an observer. He was a part of the apocalypse, a catalyst for the very events he sought to understand. The vision faded, and Leonard stumbled back, his mind racing. He didn't understand what he had seen, but he knew it wasn't a coincidence. He had touched something he shouldn't have, and now the future was unraveling. Desperate to rejoin the group, he retraced his steps, only to find them frozen in place. Their suits emitted warnings. Temporal anomaly detected. Return to portal immediately. Leonard turned toward the portal. Its once stable glow flickered violently, and the hum of its machinery was erratic. He felt the ground tremble beneath him as the air grew thick with an energy he couldn't describe. He knew he had to act quickly. If the portal collapsed, they would all be trapped in this dying future. But as he sprinted toward the portal, a shadow moved in the periphery of his vision. It was tall, amorphous, and radiated a presence that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Leonard didn't stop to look. He ran, knowing that whatever it wasn't human, and it wasn't friendly. Leonard sprinted toward the flickering portal, his boots splashing through shallow pools of water as the world around him seemed to destabilize. The once still air now pulsed with energy, and the ruined buildings groaned as if under immense pressure. The shadow that had loomed in the periphery of his vision was no longer content to stay hidden. It moved with a speed that defied its amorphous nature, flowing like liquid yet striking with the precision of a predator. Leonard dared a glance over his shoulder. The figure was gaining on him, a silhouette of shifting darkness that seemed to consume the light around it. It had no discernible face, no fixed shape, but its intent was clear. It was hunting him. He pushed himself harder, his lungs burning with every breath filtered through his suit. The portal was in sight now, its glow unstable and flickering like a dying flame. Beyond it, Leonard could see the faint outline of the facility where the journey had begun. It looked impossibly far, as though separated not just by distance, but by a chasm of time itself. A voice crackled in his earpiece, distorted but urgent. It was one of the chronologists. "Bishop, the portal's destabilizing. You have seconds to get through. Do not stop." He didn't need the warning. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to keep moving. But as he closed the distance to the portal, the ground beneath him began to shift. The surface cracked and splintered, revealing a glowing network of veins beneath. a pulsing, molten energy that seemed to mirror the light of the sphere he had touched. The shadow lunged. Leonard dove forward, barely escaping as a tendril of darkness lashed out, striking the ground where he had stood. The force of the impact sent a shockwave rippling through the terrain, and Leonard was thrown off balance. He landed hard, skidding across the uneven ground, his helmet visor cracking against a jagged edge. Dazed, he struggled to his feet, his vision swimming. The portal was flickering more violently now, its edges warping as if being pulled apart by unseen hands. Leonard's suit emitted a new warning: temporal stability at 15%. Immediate evacuation required. He forced his legs to move, each step a battle against the weight of exhaustion and the oppressive presence of the shadow. The figure was closer now, its tendrils stretching toward him with an eerie fluidity. Leonard could feel its pull, not physical but mental, a weight pressing on his thoughts, his memories. It wasn't just chasing him, it was trying to consume him. Finally, he reached the portal. The air around it crackled with energy, and the ground trembled beneath his feet. Without hesitation, Leonard threw himself forward, diving into the swirling vortex just as the shadow's tendrils closed in. The transition was violent. Unlike the journey to the future, which had been a disorienting but brief passage, this was chaos. Leonard felt as though he were being torn apart and reassembled simultaneously. His consciousness stretched across infinite planes. Fragments of time flashed before his eyes, scenes he couldn't recognize, faces he didn't know. He saw civilizations rise and fall in the blink of an eye, wars that spanned centuries, and moments of quiet beauty that seemed out of place amid the chaos. And then, he saw himself. In one fragment, he was standing in the ruins of a city, holding the sphere. In another, he was surrounded by towering waves, the shadow looming behind him. Each vision felt more real than the last, as if they weren't possibilities but inevitabilities. Leonard's mind reeled. Was this his future? Had he already caused the apocalypse he sought to understand? When he emerged on the other side, he collapsed onto the cold metal floor of the facility. The portal behind him flickered once more before collapsing in on itself, leaving only a faint shimmer in the air. Leonard lay there, gasping for breath, his body trembling from the ordeal. Around him, alarms blared, and red lights bathed the room in an ominous glow. Technicians and chronologists rushed toward him, their voices a cacophony of questions and commands. What happened? Why was the portal destabilizing? Did anyone else make it through? Leonard sat up slowly, his head spinning. The others, he began, but his voice faltered. He looked around and realized the truth. He was the only one who had returned. The debriefing was grueling. Leonard was interrogated by a panel of scientists and officials, their expressions a mixture of concern and anger. They wanted to know why the mission had failed, why the timeline had destabilized, and, most of all, what he had done. "I touched something," Leonard admitted, his voice hollow, a sphere. "It showed me things. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt like it was alive, like it was watching me." The panel exchanged uneasy glances. One of the scientists, a stern woman with sharp features, leaned forward. "Do you have any idea what you've done? That sphere wasn't just an artifact. It was a temporal nexus, a point where multiple timelines converge. By interacting with it, you didn't just observe the future. You altered it." Leonard's heart sank. "Altered it? How?" The woman's expression darkened. "The shadow you encountered, it's a byproduct of that alteration, a temporal correction force. It exists to undo anomalies in the timeline. And now it's tied to you." Leonard's mind raced. The shadow wasn't just a manifestation of the apocalypse. It was a response to his actions. It was chasing him because he had broken something fundamental. He had become an anomaly. In the days that followed, Leonard was confined to the facility under strict observation. The world outside seemed normal, but Leonard knew better. He could feel the shadow's presence, lurking at the edges of his awareness. It wasn't gone. It was waiting. One night, as he stared out of the facility's reinforced windows, Leonard noticed something strange. The stars in the sky were shifting, their patterns subtly wrong. It was a reminder that the timeline was still unstable, that the apocalypse he had witnessed wasn't just a possible future. It was a threat looming closer with every passing moment, and he knew that his role in it wasn't over. Leonard's confinement felt less like a precaution and more like a prison sentence. Days turned into weeks as the Apocalypto facility became his entire world. Outside its reinforced walls, life continued as normal, or so it seemed. But Leonard knew better. The shadow that had chased him through the apocalyptic future was still out there. He could feel its presence at the edges of his mind, an unseen specter waiting for the right moment to strike. The scientists monitoring him were relentless in their questioning. They ran tests, scanned his body for anomalies, and probed his memories of the mission. But Leonard had no answers for them, only fragments of what he had seen. The glowing symbols in the ruins, the visions of collapsing cities, and the sphere that had shown him his own role in the apocalypse. None of it made sense. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was at the center of something far greater than himself. One night, as Leonard lay awake in his sterile room, the lights began to flicker. At first, he thought it was a power fluctuation, nothing unusual in a facility running advanced temporal technology. But then he felt it, a cold, oppressive weight pressing against his chest. The air seemed to thicken, and the faint hum of the facility's machinery faded into silence. Leonard sat up, his heart pounding. The room was plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the monitoring equipment. And then he saw it, a shadow moving in the corner of the room, darker than the surrounding darkness. It shifted and twisted, its form fluid and formless, but its intent was clear. It had found him. The shadow lunged. Leonard scrambled backward, falling off the bed and crashing to the floor. The impact jolted him, but he didn't stop moving. He crawled toward the door, fumbling for the panel to open it, but his hands trembled too much to find the control. The shadow loomed over him, tendrils reaching out with a slow, deliberate menace. In a desperate act, Leonard grabbed the nearest object, a metal chair, and swung it at the shadow. The chair passed through it as if it were smoke, and Leonard felt a wave of icy dread wash over him. He was defenseless. Just as the shadow's tendrils reached him, the room was flooded with light. The shadow recoiled, retreating into the corner as the door burst open and a team of scientists and security personnel stormed in. They didn't see the shadow. It had already dissolved into the walls. But they saw Leonard, trembling and pale, his eyes wide with terror. "What happened?" one of the scientists demanded, kneeling beside him. Leonard shook his head, unable to form words. He could still feel the shadow's presence, lingering just beyond the light. The incident triggered a wave of panic within the facility. Security measures were heightened, and Leonard was moved to a more secure wing. But the shadow continued to haunt him. It appeared in the corners of his vision, in the reflections of the polished steel walls, and in the moments between waking and sleeping. It wasn't bound by the physical world, and Leonard knew it wouldn't stop until it had corrected the anomaly he had created. Desperate for answers, Leonard demanded access to the Apocalypto archives. He wanted to know everything about the sphere he had touched and the symbols he had seen in the ruins. The scientists were hesitant at first, but they eventually relented. If Leonard's insights could help stabilize the timeline, they had no choice but to let him try. The archives were vast, a labyrinth of data collected from centuries of temporal exploration. Leonard sifted through holographic displays and ancient records, searching for anything that could shed light on his situation. Days turned into nights as he pieced together fragments of information, and slowly, a pattern began to emerge. The sphere, it seemed, was not a simple artifact. It was a temporal nexus, a point of convergence where multiple timelines intersected. According to the records, such nexuses were rare and volatile, capable of warping reality if disturbed. Leonard's interaction with the sphere had not only destabilized the timeline but had also drawn the attention of the Shadow, a temporal correction force designed to eliminate anomalies. But the most alarming discovery came when Leonard found a record that mentioned his name. It was buried deep within the archives, in a section labeled Temporal Contingencies. The record described a series of events that matched what he had experienced. The expedition to 3021, the destabilization of the portal, and the emergence of the Shadow. But it also mentioned something he hadn't known: his role as a catalyst. Leonard's heart sank as he read the final line of the record. Subject Bishop, designated Anomaly Alpha, must choose. Contain the cycle or perpetuate it. The revelation shook Leonard to his core. He wasn't just a victim of circumstance. He was a key player in a cycle that had repeated itself countless times. The Shadow wasn't hunting him out of malice. It was trying to restore balance. And the only way to stop it was to make a choice. Leonard returned to his room that night with a heavy heart. The Shadow was waiting for him, as it always was, but this time he didn't run. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring into the darkness where it lurked. "I understand now," he said, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. "You're not here to destroy me. You're here to end the cycle." The Shadow didn't respond, but Leonard felt its presence shift. It was listening. "I don't know how to fix this," Leonard continued, "but I'm willing to try. If that means facing whatever comes next, so be it." The Shadow moved closer, its tendrils coiling around him like a shroud. Leonard braced himself, expecting cold, expecting pain. But instead, he felt a strange warmth, like the calm before a storm. And then everything went dark. When Leonard awoke, he was no longer in the facility. He was standing in the ruins of the future, the sphere glowing in his hands. The Shadow loomed behind him, silent but ever-present. And in that moment, Leonard understood what he had to do. He wasn't just a traveler anymore. He was a guardian of the timeline, tasked with making the ultimate choice, to preserve the cycle or to break it, no matter the cost. When Leonard opened his eyes, the world around him felt both familiar and alien. He was back in the ruins of 3021, but it was different now. The water was still dark, the skies still churned with violent storms, and the skeletal remains of skyscrapers loomed ominously, yet something had shifted. The air seemed heavier, charged with an energy that made his skin tingle. In his hands, the sphere pulsed faintly, its silvery liquid swirling in hypnotic patterns. Behind him, the Shadow waited, silent and immovable. Leonard didn't need to look to know it was there. Its presence pressed on him like a physical weight, but it no longer felt hostile. It was watching, waiting for him to make his choice. He stared into the sphere, his reflection distorted by the swirling liquid. The visions began to return. Fragments of timelines, some familiar, others utterly alien. He saw moments of triumph and despair, cities flourishing and crumbling, people laughing, crying, and vanishing into the void. Each vision felt more real than the last, as if he were living them himself. And then he saw it. The moment the cycle began, the vision was unmistakable. He saw himself standing in the ruins, holding the sphere, just as he was now. But in the vision, he wasn't alone. Behind him, the Shadow loomed larger, its tendrils stretching out across the skyline, wrapping around the ruins like chains. The sky cracked open, and the world began to unravel, consumed by the chaos of overlapping timelines. Leonard staggered back, breaking his gaze from the sphere. His mind reeled. The shadow wasn't just a force of correction. It was a harbinger of the cycle, a guardian of its perpetuation. And he was the key that kept it turning. "You've been here before," Leonard whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant rumble of thunder. "Haven't you?" The shadow didn't respond, but Leonard felt its presence grow heavier, as though it were acknowledging his words. Leonard walked through the ruins, the sphere cradled in his hands. He could feel the weight of its power, the potential it held to shape the fate of countless timelines. As he moved, the environment around him began to shift. The ruins blurred and twisted, transforming into fragments of other places, other times. He saw a lush forest teeming with life, a barren desert under a blood-red sun, a bustling metropolis filled with flying vehicles. Each fragment flickered in and out of existence, as though the fabric of reality itself were fraying. The shadow followed him, its form shifting to match the changing environments. Leonard could feel its gaze, its silent demand. Make the choice. Finally, he came to a clearing in the ruins, a place where the ground was smooth and the air was still. The chaos around him seemed to pause, as if the world were holding its breath. Leonard knelt and placed the sphere on the ground, its glow illuminating the cracks in the earth. "What happens if I destroy it?" he asked aloud, though he wasn't sure who he was asking. The shadow, the sphere, or himself? The answer came not in words, but in a flood of images. He saw timelines collapsing into one another, universes folding and breaking, an endless cascade of destruction that spread across the multiverse. The sphere was not just a nexus. It was a stabilizer, a fragile anchor holding the fractured timelines together. But then came another vision, a glimmer of hope. He saw the sphere shatter, and though the destruction was immense, it was not absolute. New timelines began to emerge, new possibilities, unbound by the cycles of the past. It was chaos, but it was also freedom. Leonard closed his eyes, his mind racing. Destroying the sphere would mean sacrificing stability, risking untold destruction. But leaving it intact would mean perpetuating the cycle, dooming the timeline to repeat its apocalyptic end over and over again. The shadow moved closer, its tendrils encircling him. Leonard felt its presence like a storm about to break, its silent demand growing more insistent. It was not a being of malice, but of necessity, a force that existed to maintain the status quo. "I understand now," Leonard said, opening his eyes. "You're not my enemy. You're part of the system, just like the sphere. Just like me." The shadow paused, as if considering his words. For the first time, Leonard felt a strange sense of connection to it, a shared purpose, a shared burden. "I'm sorry," he continued, "but the cycle has to end." With trembling hands, Leonard reached for the sphere. Its surface was cool and smooth, but he could feel the power pulsing within it, alive and aware. He lifted it high above his head, and for a brief moment, he hesitated. The enormity of what he was about to do weighed on him. This wasn't just a choice for himself. It was a choice for every timeline, every life that had ever existed or would exist. And then he brought the sphere down with all his strength. The impact was deafening. The sphere shattered, releasing a blinding light that engulfed the ruins. Leonard felt himself being pulled in every direction at once, his body disintegrating and reassembling in a cycle of endless motion. The light grew brighter, consuming everything, until there was nothing left but silence. When Leonard opened his eyes again, he was standing in a vast, empty expanse. The ruins were gone. The shadow was gone. He was alone. But as he looked around, he began to see flickers of light, tiny sparks that grew into brilliant stars. Each one was a timeline, a new possibility born from the destruction of the old. The cycle was broken, and in its place was something entirely new. Leonard smiled, though tears streamed down his face. He had paid the price, but it was worth it. The future was no longer written. It was infinite. The cafe outside of time. In the heart of a city that never seemed to rest, there was a narrow alley that people rarely noticed. Tucked between towering buildings with gleaming glass facades, the alley was unremarkable at first glance. Cracked pavement, graffiti-covered walls, and a persistent silence that felt out of place amidst the city's perpetual buzz. Yet, every so often, during the height of a storm, something extraordinary would appear within its shadowed confines. A cafe would materialize. It didn't have a name or any signs announcing its existence. Its windows, faintly glowing, were obscured by curtains, and its wooden door was so weathered it seemed like it had been carved in another era. To the casual passerby, it might have looked like an abandoned relic of the past. But those who entered knew better. Once inside, it was clear that the cafe was something far beyond the ordinary. Martin Langley was one of those who found it, though he would later claim the cafe had found him. Martin was a journalist, the kind who prowled the streets in search of stories others overlooked. He thrived on the peculiar, the unexplained, and the bizarre. That night, he had been wandering the rain-slicked streets, camera slung over his shoulder, hoping to capture the city's underbelly during the thunderstorm. The skies flashed with electric fury, illuminating the alley for a brief moment. And there it was, the cafe. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light. The alley had been empty moments ago. Yet now, there was a door where none had been before. Intrigued, Martin hesitated. The storm raged above him, lightning tearing across the sky, but the soft glow from the cafe's windows called to him. Adjusting his camera, he approached. When he pushed the door open, a bell above jingled softly, and he stepped into a world that defied explanation. The interior was warm and inviting, though undeniably peculiar. The wooden tables and chairs bore the marks of age, as though they had been used for centuries. The walls were adorned with clocks, hundreds of them, each frozen at a different time. Shelves lined with mismatched books and trinkets cast long shadows in the dim light. In one corner, a fireplace crackled softly, despite the absence of any discernible source of heat. Martin stood there, dripping rainwater onto the polished floor, his gaze darting across the room. It was then that he noticed the patrons. There weren't many of them, but they were a curious mix. At one table sat a man in a suit that looked straight out of the 1920s, flipping through a yellowed newspaper. Across from him, a woman in a Victorian dress stirred her tea with a spoon that glinted like silver. Near the fireplace, a man in futuristic attire fiddled with a holographic device, his face illuminated by the soft glow of its projections. First time, a voice called out. Martin turned to see a woman standing behind the counter. She looked to be in her early 30s, with a sharp but kind expression. Her hair was pulled back, and her apron was spotless, as though she had been expecting him. Without waiting for his response, she placed a steaming cup of coffee on the counter. "Sit. Drink. The rules are simple," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "No questions about where you are. And never, ever ask anyone how their time ends." Martin frowned but took the coffee. "What do you mean, how their time ends?" The woman didn't answer. She simply smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and gestured for him to find a seat. Martin chose a table near the fireplace, where he could observe the other patrons. The man in the suit glanced at him briefly before returning to his newspaper. The woman in Victorian garb gave him a polite nod. The man with the holographic device didn't look up at all. They all seemed at ease, as though they belonged there, as though the strangeness of the cafe was perfectly normal. Martin sipped his coffee, and tried to make sense of what he was experiencing. The storm outside was still raging, but within the cafe, everything was calm. Time itself seemed to slow, the minutes stretching into something unquantifiable. He pulled out his camera, intending to document the peculiar space, but when he tried to take a picture, the camera's display was blank. It wouldn't even turn on. "The cafe doesn't like being photographed," the woman behind the counter said, her voice startling him. Martin set the camera down, unnerved. "What is this place?" he asked. "The cafe outside of time," she replied, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "People come here when they need to, not when they want to." Her answer only raised more questions, but Martin knew better than to push. Instead, he watched as another patron entered. A man in a rain-soaked coat who looked around nervously before taking a seat near the back. The new arrival seemed out of place, even in a place as strange as this. He clutched a pocket watch tightly, his knuckles white, and muttered to himself as he stared at the clocks on the walls. Martin's curiosity got the better of him. He approached the man cautiously. "Rough night?" he asked. The man looked up sharply, his eyes wide with fear. Don't talk to me," he whispered. "I don't have much time left." Martin hesitated. The man's words sent a chill down his spine. Before he could respond, the man stood abruptly and bolted for the door, leaving the pocket watch behind. The cafe fell silent as everyone watched him go. When the door slammed shut, the woman behind the counter let out a soft sigh. "They never listen," she muttered, shaking her head. Martin picked up the abandoned pocket watch. It was old but meticulously crafted, its face adorned with strange symbols instead of numbers. The hands were spinning wildly, faster than any normal watch should. He looked to the woman behind the counter for an explanation, but she simply said, "It's his time running out." Before Martin could ask what she meant, the watch stopped. The hands froze, pointing to a time that didn't exist. The storm outside grew louder, and Martin felt a strange sensation in the pit of his stomach, an unshakable feeling that the cafe was more than just a refuge from the storm. It was a place where time itself was unraveled and rewoven, and he was now a part of its mysteries. The pocket watch felt unnaturally heavy in Martin's hand. Its face, adorned with swirling symbols instead of numbers, was now eerily still. He couldn't shake the sensation that the watch wasn't broken. It had simply stopped because its time had run out. The storm outside thundered ominously, but inside the cafe, the air was thick with a silence that felt charged, as though every patron were holding their breath. The woman behind the counter broke the tension. "Leave it," she said, her tone flat but commanding. "It's no longer yours to carry." Martin placed the watch on the table, but his mind raced with questions. He wanted to know more about the man who had fled, about the cafe, about the strange rules that seemed to govern this place. But the memory of her earlier warning lingered. No questions about where you are. And never, ever ask anyone how their time ends. "Fine," Martin said, more to himself than anyone else. "But someone has to explain what's going on." The woman looked at him, her expression unreadable. "This cafe isn't a place for explanations. It's a crossing point. People come here when their timelines are fragile, when they're at risk of breaking, or when they've already started to fray." Martin frowned. "Fray? What does that even mean?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "It means their time is out of sync. They've become untethered from their natural flow. Some people come here to fix it. Others come because it's too late." He gestured toward the pocket watch. "And what about him? The guy who left in such a hurry?" The woman sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "He came too late. His time was already broken. The watch was his last chance, and he didn't take it." Martin glanced around the cafe. The other patrons seemed strangely unaffected by the tension. The man in the suit continued reading his newspaper, and the woman in the Victorian dress sipped her tea. Even the man with the holographic device didn't look up from his work. It was as if they existed in their own bubbles, untouched by the drama unfolding around them. Martin leaned closer to the woman behind the counter. "You seem to know a lot about this place. Who are you? Really?" She raised an eyebrow. "I'm the caretaker." "That's all you need to know." "That's not much of an answer. It's the only one you're getting." Martin sat back, frustrated. He had spent years as a journalist chasing elusive stories, but nothing had ever felt as slippery as this. The cafe itself seemed to defy logic, as though it existed in a liminal space where the normal rules of reality didn't apply. And the caretaker? She knew more than she let on, but she wasn't going to make it easy for him. As he brooded over his coffee, Martin noticed something strange. One of the clocks on the wall, a small brass piece with ornate hands, began to tick. It was the first clock he had seen move since entering the cafe. The ticking was soft but deliberate, and as it echoed through the room, the other patrons began to stir. The man in the suit folded his newspaper and stood. The woman in the Victorian dress finished her tea and placed the cup neatly on the table. Even the man with the holographic device closed it with a sharp motion. They all moved toward the door, their steps synchronized as though guided by an unseen force. Martin turned to the caretaker. "What's happening?" She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze was fixed on the departing patrons, her expression tinged with something that might have been regret. "Their time is up," she said finally. "They've made their choices." Martin watched as the patrons left the cafe, one by one. When the last of them had disappeared through the door, the ticking clock stopped and the silence returned. The caretaker exhaled slowly. "Not everyone gets a second chance," she said, almost to herself. Martin felt a chill creep down his spine. "What happens to them now?" She met his gaze, her eyes sharp. "That's not for you to know. Your time hasn't come yet." Martin couldn't stop thinking about the strange procession. The patrons had left so calmly, as if they had accepted their fate. But the man with the pocket watch had been different. He had run, terrified, only to leave his watch behind. What would have happened if he had stayed? Was there a way to fix his broken time? Unable to let it go, Martin turned his attention to the cafe itself. There had to be clues hidden in its peculiar decor. He began to wander, examining the clocks on the walls and the trinkets on the shelves. Every object seemed significant, as though it had been carefully chosen to hold a piece of the cafe's story. One shelf caught his eye. It held a row of glass jars, each filled with a faintly glowing liquid. When Martin looked closer, he saw shapes moving within the jars, tiny, flickering images that resembled moments frozen in time. In one jar, he saw a child blowing out birthday candles. In another, a soldier embracing a loved one. The scenes were fleeting, disappearing as soon as he tried to focus on them. "Memories," the caretaker said from behind him. Martin jumped, nearly knocking over one of the jars. "Are you trying to give me a heart attack?" he said, clutching his chest. She ignored his question. "Those are fragments of time. Pieces of people's lives that have slipped through the cracks. The cafe collects them." Martin stared at the jars, mesmerized. "Why? What's the point?" "To give them back," she said simply. "Sometimes, people lose parts of themselves. The cafe helps them find what they're missing, if they're willing to pay the price." He turned to her, his curiosity ignited. "What kind of price?" The caretaker's expression hardened. "That depends on the person. For some, it's a memory they cherish. For others, it's an opportunity they'll never have again. Time doesn't give without taking something in return." Martin felt a knot form in his stomach. The cafe was more than a refuge. It was a place of reckoning. Every patron who entered was faced with a choice: to confront their broken time or to let it consume them. As he considered this, the bell above the door jingled, and a new patron entered. It was a woman, her face pale and drawn, clutching a photograph in her hands. She approached the counter slowly, her eyes filled with desperation. "I need to go back," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to fix it." The caretaker studied her for a long moment before nodding. "You know the price." The woman swallowed hard and nodded. "I'll pay it." Martin watched, transfixed, as the caretaker handed the woman a small, glowing jar. The woman cradled it like it was the most precious thing in the world before walking to one of the clocks on the wall. She placed the jar beneath it, and as the clock's hands began to move, she disappeared. The cafe was silent once more. Martin turned to the caretaker, his mind racing with questions. What just happened? "She made her choice," the caretaker said, "and now it's her time to face it." The silence that followed the woman's disappearance felt heavier than the storm outside. Martin stood frozen, staring at the clock where she had placed the glowing jar. Its hands, now still, seemed to radiate an eerie finality. He felt an urge to ask the caretaker more questions, but her expression told him that no answers would come easily. Martin returned to his table, his thoughts a whirlwind of possibilities. The cafe was more than a refuge. It was a crossroad where time fractured, reformed, or unraveled completely. He had seen people come and go, leaving parts of themselves behind, and now he wondered what the cafe had in store for him. "Do I have a choice here?" he asked aloud, unsure if he was speaking to himself or the caretaker. Her voice carried over from the counter. "Everyone does. But not all choices are obvious." Martin let out a frustrated laugh, cryptic as ever. "Thanks for that." She didn't respond, leaving him to wrestle with his thoughts. The pocket watch, the glowing jars, the frozen clocks, all of it felt like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. And yet, he couldn't ignore the pull he felt toward the cafe, as if it were unraveling something deep inside him. Hours passed. The storm outside began to subside, but the air within the cafe remained charged, heavy with the unspoken weight of time. Martin continued to explore, observing the oddities scattered throughout the room. He noticed a mirror near the fireplace, its surface oddly reflective, as though it were made of liquid rather than glass. When he approached it, his reflection stared back with a strange intensity. But something was wrong. The reflection didn't match his movements. It lingered a second too long, its eyes filled with an emotion Martin couldn't identify. Then, without warning, it smiled, a small, knowing smile that sent chills down his spine. "What the hell?" he muttered, stepping back. The caretaker appeared beside him, her sudden presence making him jump. "The mirror doesn't lie," she said. "It shows what you bring with you." Martin pointed at his reflection, which had now returned to normal. "What was that? Why did it?" "It's not about what the mirror does," she interrupted. "It's about what you see." Martin frowned, but he let the subject drop. He had a growing suspicion that pushing too hard for answers would only leave him more confused. As night fell, the cafe grew quieter. The few patrons who remained kept to themselves, their conversations muted, their actions deliberate. Martin noticed one man pacing near the shelves of jars, his hands shaking as he examined each one. Another sat in the corner, staring at a photograph that he held tightly, as if letting go would mean losing something irreplaceable. The tension was palpable, and Martin felt it seeping into his own thoughts. He couldn't stop thinking about the pocket watch and the woman with the jar. What had the cafe taken from them? What had it given in return? "Why are you still here?" The caretaker's voice broke his reverie. Martin looked up to see her standing over him, her arms crossed. "I'm trying to understand," he admitted. "This place, it's like it's alive." She gave a small nod. "The cafe is a reflection of time itself. It's not alive, but it's not just a place either. It's a point of convergence, where broken timelines come to mend or to end, Martin gestured toward the glowing jars on the shelves. And those? What are they? Fragments, she said. Moments that slipped through the cracks. Some are memories, others are entire days. The cafe collects them, holds them for those who need them. But claiming them always comes at a cost. Martin leaned forward. What kind of cost? The caretaker's gaze darkened. Time is a balance. To reclaim something, you must give something in return. A memory for a memory. A moment for a moment. The cafe doesn't decide the cost. You do? Martin stared at her, his mind racing. The cafe was a place of impossible choices, where people bargained with time itself. And yet, he felt drawn to it, as though it held something he needed. Has anyone ever refused to pay the cost? He asked. She nodded slowly. They leave. But the cost doesn't disappear. Time has a way of collecting its debts, one way or another. The next morning, Martin woke to the sound of the bell above the cafe door. He had fallen asleep at his table, his dreams a tangle of fractured timelines and flickering images. When he looked toward the door, he saw a man entering, a new patron, his face pale and lined with worry. The man approached the counter, carrying a small box. I found this, he said, his voice trembling. It belonged to my father. I don't know why, but I thought I should bring it here. The caretaker studied the box for a moment before nodding. You're in the right place. She opened the box, revealing a pocket watch similar to the one Martin had seen the night before. The man stared at it, his hands trembling. I don't understand, he said. What does it mean? It's a fragment, she explained. A piece of time that was lost. If you're willing, the cafe can help you find the rest. The man hesitated. And the cost? The caretaker's expression softened. You already know it. The man's shoulders slumped, but he nodded. Do it. The caretaker took the watch and placed it beneath one of the clocks on the wall. The clock's hands began to move, and the room filled with a faint hum. The man closed his eyes, and for a moment, he seemed at peace. Then, he vanished. Martin stared at the spot where the man had stood, his mind reeling. Where did he go? He demanded. The caretaker turned to him, her expression unreadable. He went back to find what he lost. Whether he returns, that's up to him. The cafe's stillness after the man's disappearance felt heavier than ever. Martin stared at the space where the man had stood, trying to reconcile what he had just witnessed. The caretaker moved with practiced calm, returning to her post behind the counter as if nothing unusual had occurred. But for Martin, the air felt charged, as though the cafe itself was waiting for him to act. What happens if he doesn't come back? Martin asked, breaking the silence. The caretaker didn't look at him. Some do, some don't. It depends on what they're willing to face. Martin frowned. Face what? The truth, she said simply. Her words lingered in Martin's mind as he wandered back to his table. The cafe was a place of choices, but it was also a place of reckoning. Every person who entered carried their own broken fragments, their own unresolved moments, and the cafe, in its peculiar way, forced them to confront those pieces, whether they were ready or not. The day passed in a haze. Martin watched as more patrons entered the cafe, each bringing their own mysteries. A woman in a tattered raincoat handed the caretaker a locket, its clasp broken and its contents hidden. A young man arrived with nothing but a name, written on a crumpled piece of paper. Each exchange was brief, almost ritualistic, and each patron disappeared, leaving Martin with more questions than answers. By evening, the cafe was nearly empty. The storm outside had subsided, but the air inside was still thick with tension. Martin sat at his table, staring into the last dregs of his coffee, when the caretaker approached him. You've been here longer than most, she said. Martin looked up, meeting her gaze. I'm trying to understand. Why does this place exist? Why me? She tilted her head, considering him. The cafe isn't about understanding. It's about choice. Everyone who finds their way here has a decision to make. Martin gestured around the room. And what about me? What's my decision? The caretaker reached into her pocket and pulled out an object, placing it gently on the table in front of him. It was a small, glowing jar, its contents swirling like liquid light. Inside, Martin saw flickers of movement, a figure running through a city, a woman's hand reaching out, and finally, his own reflection, staring back at him with an expression of desperation. "This," she said, "is your moment." Martin's breath caught. "What is it?" "A fragment," she explained. "Something you lost. Something you've been searching for, whether you know it or not." Martin reached for the jar, but her hand shot out, stopping him. "Not yet," she said. "First, you need to understand the cost." Martin hesitated. "What's the cost?" She leaned closer, her voice low. "The cafe doesn't decide. You do. To reclaim this, you have to let go of something else. Something important." Martin stared at the jar, his mind racing. He thought of the choices he had made in his life, the stories he had chased, the sacrifices he had justified in the name of ambition. He thought of the relationships he had let slip away, the friends he no longer called, the family he had grown distant from. And in that moment, he understood. "What if I don't take it?" he asked quietly. The caretaker's expression softened. "Then you leave, and the cafe lets you go. But the fragment will stay here, waiting for the next time your path crosses ours." Martin looked at her sharply. "Next time? How many times can someone find this place?" "As many as it takes," she said. "But the longer you wait, the more the fragments slip through your fingers. The cafe can't hold them forever." Martin's hand hovered over the jar. He could feel its warmth, its pull. The images inside seemed to glow brighter, as if urging him to act. But the weight of the decision pressed down on him. He didn't know what the cafe would take, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. Finally, he made his choice. He wrapped his fingers around the jar, and the moment he did, the world shifted. The cafe blurred, its walls dissolving into a kaleidoscope of colors and light. Martin felt himself falling, spinning through fragments of time. He saw moments from his own life, conversations he had forgotten, faces he hadn't seen in years, opportunities he had let slip away. And then, he saw the moment he had reclaimed. It was a memory from years ago, one he had buried deep. He was sitting on a park bench, a notebook in his lap, as a woman stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder. They were laughing, their voices mingling with the rustle of leaves in the autumn breeze. It was a simple moment, but it was filled with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. As the memory unfolded, Martin felt a sharp pang of loss. He realized what the cafe had taken in return. A memory of his own ambition, the fire that had driven him to chase stories at any cost. It was a part of him that he had thought defined him, and now it was gone. When Martin opened his eyes, he was back in the cafe. The jar was gone, and the caretaker stood nearby, watching him with a knowing expression. "You paid the price," she said. Martin nodded, his chest heavy but his mind clearer than it had been in years. "I get it now," he said. "The cafe doesn't just give back what's lost. It forces you to decide what really matters." The caretaker smiled faintly. "Time is fragile, Martin. The cafe gives you a chance to mend it, but only you can decide how." Martin stood, the weight of his choice settling over him. As he walked to the door, he glanced back one last time. The caretaker was already returning to her work, her presence a quiet constant in the ever-shifting flow of the cafe. When Martin stepped outside, the storm had cleared and the alley was empty. The cafe was gone, as though it had never been there. But Martin felt its presence lingering, like a shadow at the edge of his thoughts. He knew he would never be the same. The Fisher of Days. In a small coastal village where the air always carried the scent of salt and seaweed, there was a river unlike any other. It wasn't the largest or the swiftest river, nor did it carve majestic canyons or power mighty mills. But the villagers knew better than to underestimate it. The river was old, older than the cliffs it carved through, older than the forest that grew along its banks. And to those who paid attention, it held secrets as deep as time itself. The villagers called it the time's thread, though few could say why. They spoke in hushed tones about its strange currents, how its surface shimmered like liquid glass under the moonlight, and how it seemed to reflect not the world around it, but something altogether different. Some claimed it showed them glimpses of forgotten memories. Others swore it revealed futures that had yet to unfold. But most villagers avoided the river altogether. It was easier to live without questions that had no answers. Yet, every morning without fail, a lone figure could be seen sitting by its edge. The man was a mystery, known only as the Fisher. He lived in a small, ramshackle cabin just upstream, a structure so weathered it looked ready to collapse with the next storm. But it never did, just as the man himself never seemed to age. The villagers whispered about him, spinning tales of his peculiar habits. They said he didn't fish for food or sport. He fished for days. Emma, the youngest daughter of the village baker, had always been fascinated by the Fisher. She often watched him from a distance, her curiosity piqued by his quiet persistence. While other villagers spoke of him with fear or disdain, Emma felt a pull toward him, as if the answers to the questions that filled her restless mind lay somewhere in the folds of his silence. One morning, unable to resist the urge any longer, Emma ventured to the river's edge. The sun had just begun its ascent, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. The Fisher was already there, his silhouette still and focused, his fishing line cast into the shimmering water. Emma approached cautiously, her boots crunching softly on the gravel shore. "You're up early," she said, breaking the silence. The Fisher didn't turn, didn't even flinch. His hands, weathered and strong, remained steady on the fishing rod. "The river doesn't wait," he replied after a moment, his voice deep and calm. Emma stepped closer, emboldened by his lack of hostility. "What are you fishing for?" He smiled faintly, though he still didn't look at her. "Days." The simplicity of his answer startled her. She had heard the rumors, of course, but hearing it spoken aloud was different. "Days?" she echoed. "What does that mean?" The Fisher finally turned to face her. His eyes, dark and penetrating, seemed to hold the weight of centuries. "The river carries time, just as it carries water. Moments slip into its currents, days that were forgotten, stolen, or lost. I catch them." Emma stared at him, unsure whether to laugh or shiver. "That's impossible." "Is it?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. He nodded toward the water. "Look closely." She hesitated, then crouched by the riverbank, peering into the clear, rippling water. At first, she saw nothing but the reflection of the trees and sky. But as she stared longer, the surface began to change. Shadows danced beneath the water, forming shapes, images. She saw a man and woman walking hand in hand along a cobblestone street, a child chasing a butterfly through a field of wildflowers, a soldier standing at attention beneath a flag. The images came and went like flickers of light, never lingering long enough for her to fully grasp them. Emma gasped, falling back onto the grass. What is this?" The Fisher's gaze returned to the water. "Fragments of time," he said. "Moments that have slipped from the flow. Some are happy. Others," his voice trailed off. Emma looked at him, her curiosity now tinged with fear. "Why do you catch them?" "To keep them safe," he replied. "The river is full of power, but it's dangerous. A lost day can change everything if it falls into the wrong hands, or if it's reclaimed by someone who isn't ready. Emma visited the fisher often after that day. She would sit beside him as he cast his line into the shimmering water, watching as he pulled out strange, glowing spheres. Each one contained a fragment of time, a memory, a moment, a day. Some he returned to the river. Others he stored carefully in a wooden chest beside him. "What happens to the ones you keep?" Emma asked one afternoon, her legs dangling over the edge of the riverbank. "They wait," he said simply. "For the right person." Emma frowned. "And how do you know who that is?" The fisher smiled faintly, as though at a private joke. "The river tells me." Emma wasn't satisfied with his answer, but she didn't press him. Instead, she focused on the river, watching its surface shift and shimmer. She thought of her own life, of the days she had spent in the bakery, kneading dough and frosting cakes, dreaming of a world beyond the village. She wondered if the river held any of her lost days, if she had fragments of time waiting to be reclaimed. "Have you ever caught one of your own days?" she asked suddenly. The fisher's expression darkened. For a long moment, he didn't speak. When he finally answered, his voice was softer, more distant. "Once." Emma leaned closer, sensing a story. "What happened?" He shook his head. "Some days are better left in the river." As the weeks went by, Emma began to feel a strange connection to the river. She started to see its patterns, the way the currents shifted and the images formed. She even began to predict when the fisher's line would catch something, her instincts surprising even him. "You have a gift," he told her one morning. "The river speaks to you." Emma didn't know what to say. She felt both exhilarated and frightened by the idea. The river was a mystery, an enigma that defied logic. And yet, she couldn't deny its pull. But deep down, she also felt something else. A sense that the river held answers she wasn't ready to face. The river's pull became a constant in Emma's life. She spent hours by its banks, watching the fisher cast his line into the shimmering waters, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The river felt alive to her now, a being with secrets it whispered only to those who dared listen. And as much as Emma tried to resist, she found herself drawn deeper into its mysteries. One morning, Emma noticed the fisher examining a glowing sphere he had just pulled from the river. It was no larger than an apple, its surface smooth and pulsating faintly with light. Within it, Emma could see fragments of movement, figures walking, laughing, and crying, their faces blurred but their emotions unmistakable. "What's in there?" she asked, unable to hide her curiosity. The fisher didn't look up. "A day," he said. "A moment someone loved and lost." Emma leaned closer. "What will you do with it?" He studied the sphere for a long moment before placing it carefully into the wooden chest beside him. "This one waits." "For who?" "For the one it belongs to," he replied. Emma frowned. "How do you know who that is?" The fisher met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "The river knows." That evening, Emma couldn't sleep. The image of the glowing sphere lingered in her mind, filling her thoughts with questions she couldn't answer. Who had lost that day? What had made it so precious? And why did the fisher believe it could only be returned to its rightful owner? Unable to shake her restlessness, she left her house and made her way to the river. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light reflecting off the water. The fisher was still there, his silhouette illuminated by the faint glow of the spheres in his chest. "You never sleep, do you?" Emma said as she approached. The fisher didn't look at her, but there was a trace of amusement in his voice. "Time doesn't rest. Why should I?" Emma sat beside him, watching as he cast his line into the water. "Do you ever wonder what it's all for?" she asked. "Why the river does what it does?" The fisher tilted his head, considering her question. "I used to," he admitted. "But the river doesn't answer questions. It just flows. Emma sighed, staring into the water. The current seemed slower tonight, its surface unusually calm. As she watched, she thought she saw her own reflection in the ripples. But it wasn't her as she was now. It was her as a child, running through the fields behind the bakery, her face alight with laughter. She blinked, and the image was gone. "I saw something," she said quietly. The fisher's gaze turned sharp. "What did you see?" "Myself," Emma whispered. "From years ago." The fisher nodded slowly. "The river shows you what you carry. Fragments of your time, scattered in its flow." Emma hesitated. Could I get them back?" The fisher's expression darkened. "You could, but there's a price." The idea of reclaiming her lost moments consumed Emma in the days that followed. She thought of all the memories she might find in the river, the days of joy and laughter, the times she felt truly alive. But the fisher's warning echoed in her mind. There's a price. One afternoon, as they sat by the river, Emma finally gathered the courage to ask, "What's the price?" The fisher didn't answer right away. Instead, he cast his line again, pulling another sphere from the water. This one was darker, its glow faint and flickering. He held it up for her to see. "Every day reclaimed takes something in return," he said. "A memory, a feeling, a piece of yourself. The river doesn't give without taking." Emma stared at the sphere, her heart pounding. "And what happens if someone isn't willing to pay?" "They lose more than they bargained for," he said quietly. "The river doesn't forgive greed." Despite the fisher's warnings, Emma couldn't let go of the idea. The river called to her, its secrets tempting her in ways she couldn't resist. Late one night, when the village was asleep and the air was thick with the scent of rain, she returned to the river alone. The water was still, its surface like glass. Emma knelt at the edge, peering into its depths. As she stared, the images began to form again, fragments of days long past. She saw her mother smile as they baked bread together, her father's laughter as he lifted her onto his shoulders, the golden light of the fields where she used to play. Tears pricked her eyes. "Please," she whispered, "let me have them back." The water rippled, and a glowing sphere rose slowly to the surface. Emma reached out, her hand trembling, but just as her fingers brushed against it, she heard a voice behind her. "Don't." She turned to see the fisher standing there, his expression grim. "You're not ready." Emma stood, anger flaring in her chest. "How do you know that?" "They're my days." "They are," he said, "but the price is higher than you think. If you take them before you're ready, you'll lose more than you gain." Emma's hands clenched into fists. "How would you know?" The fisher's gaze darkened. "Because I've made the same mistake." The next day, Emma sat with the fisher by the river, her frustration simmering beneath the surface. She watched as he caught another glowing sphere, his movements calm and deliberate. For the first time, she noticed how tired he looked, how the lines on his face seemed deeper, his shoulders heavier. "You said you made the same mistake," she said finally. "What did you mean?" The fisher didn't answer right away. He stared at the water, his expression distant. "I once caught a day that belonged to me," he said. "It was a day I loved more than anything, a moment of pure happiness. I thought I could keep it, relive it forever. But I didn't understand the cost." Emma waited, her heart pounding. "What did it take from you?" The fisher looked at her, his eyes filled with a sadness she couldn't fathom. "It took my future. I became the guardian of the river, bound to it for the rest of my days. Now, I catch moments for others, but I can never reclaim my own." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. The fisher's story was a warning, but it only deepened her questions. What would the river demand of her? And would she be willing to pay the price? The fisher's revelation weighed heavily on Emma. The river, which had once seemed like a place of wonder and possibility, now felt ominous. She couldn't stop thinking about his words. "It took my future." What did that mean? Was he trapped here forever? And if the river demanded such a price from him, what would it ask of her? But despite her fear, Emma couldn't stay away. The pull of the river was stronger than her apprehension, and its shimmering surface seemed to call to her, whispering promises of answers she couldn't find elsewhere. One misty morning, Emma returned to the riverbank, carrying nothing but her curiosity and 1,000 unanswered questions. The fisher was already there, as usual, his silhouette framed by the rising sun. He sat with his rod in hand, his line cast into the slow-moving water. "Why do you keep doing this?" Emma asked as she sat beside him. "If the river took your future, why not leave?" The fisher glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Because someone has to do it," he said. "The river doesn't stop flowing, and the days don't stop slipping through its currents. If I don't catch them, they're lost forever." Emma frowned. "But what about you? Don't you deserve to live your own life?" He smiled faintly, though there was no joy in it. "This is my life now." For a while, they sat in silence, listening to the gentle ripple of the water. Emma couldn't help but wonder if the fisher regretted his choices. Did he ever long to reclaim the life he had sacrificed? Or had he truly made peace with his fate? That afternoon, the fisher caught a sphere unlike any Emma had seen before. It glowed with a soft, golden light, and within it, she saw an image that took her breath away. A woman standing in a field of wildflowers, her arms outstretched as if embracing the wind. The scene was simple but beautiful, radiating a warmth that Emma could feel even from a distance. "Whose day is that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The fisher studied the sphere for a long moment. "Mine," he said quietly. Emma stared at him, shocked. "Yours? I thought you said you couldn't reclaim your own days." "I can't," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "But the river doesn't forget. It brings them back, sometimes as a reminder, sometimes as a temptation." Emma watched as he placed the sphere gently into his chest, his movements slow and deliberate. "What will you do with it?" she asked. "Keep it safe," he said, "for as long as I can." The days turned into weeks, and Emma's connection to the river deepened. She began to see patterns in its flow, noticing how certain currents seemed to shimmer brighter than others. She started to predict when the fisher's line would catch something, her instincts growing sharper with each passing day. "You're learning," the fisher said one morning, his tone tinged with approval. Emma nodded, though she wasn't sure what she was learning or why. The river had become a part of her, its rhythms echoing in her thoughts even when she was far from its banks. She felt as though it was preparing her for something, though she didn't know what. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the river turned to liquid silver, Emma saw something that made her heart stop. A sphere rose slowly from the water, glowing with a light that was both familiar and foreign. Inside it, she saw herself, laughing, carefree, running through the fields behind the bakery. Her breath caught. It was her day. The fisher noticed her reaction and followed her gaze. His expression darkened. "Don't," he said sharply. Emma turned to him, her hands trembling. "It's mine." "I know it is." He shook his head. "The river shows you what you carry, but that doesn't mean you're ready to take it back." Emma stood, her chest tight with emotion. "How do you know what I'm ready for? This is my life, my memory." The fisher rose slowly, his eyes locked on hers. "You don't understand what the river takes. If you claim that day, it will demand something in return, something you might not be willing to lose." Emma hesitated, her resolve wavering. She looked at the sphere again, its light reflecting in her tear-filled eyes. "What if I am willing? What if I'm ready to pay the price?" The fisher's expression softened, though the sadness in his eyes deepened. then you'll have to decide for yourself. But know this, the river never gives without taking. And once you've made your choice, there's no going back. Emma spent the night by the river, unable to leave the sphere behind. She watched it float just beneath the surface, its light casting ripples of gold across the water. Her mind was a storm of doubt and longing. She thought of the joy that day had brought her, the warmth of her parents' laughter, the freedom of running through the fields. But she also thought of the fisher's warning and the price she might have to pay. As dawn approached, Emma made her decision. She reached into the water, her fingers brushing against the sphere's smooth surface. The moment she touched it, a surge of warmth flooded her body, and the world around her seemed to dissolve. She saw the memory unfold before her eyes, felt the sunlight on her skin, the grass beneath her feet, the joy that filled her heart. It was as vivid as the day it had happened, a fragment of time brought back to life. But then, the warmth began to fade. Emma felt a sharp tug deep within her, as if something essential was being pulled away. She gasped, clutching her chest as the sphere dissolved in her hands. The world around her returned, but it felt different, dimmer, heavier. She turned to the fisher, her voice trembling. "What did I lose?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at her with an expression of quiet sorrow. "A part of yourself," he said finally. "The river always takes something equal to what it gives." Emma sank to her knees, her mind racing. She tried to recall her decision, to make sense of what she had traded, but the memory eluded her. All she knew was that the day she had reclaimed was now a part of her once more, but at a cost she couldn't fully comprehend. The morning after Emma reclaimed her lost day, the river seemed quieter than usual. Its currents were slower, its surface smoother, as though it, too, was reflecting on the choice she had made. Emma sat at the water's edge, her arms wrapped around her knees. The warmth of the memory she had retrieved lingered in her heart, but there was also an emptiness she couldn't explain. A hollow space where something important had once been. The fisher stood nearby, his line cast into the river as always. He hadn't spoken much since Emma's choice, but his presence felt heavier, as though he carried some unspoken burden. "What did I lose?" Emma asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The fisher didn't look at her. "You already know." Emma shook her head, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "I don't. I feel it, but I can't name it. It's like something slipped away when I wasn't looking." The fisher reeled in his line, empty as it often was. He turned to her, his eyes filled with the same quiet sorrow she had seen the night before. "The river doesn't take randomly," he said. "It takes what matters most in the moment. For some, it's a memory. For others, it's a feeling, an opportunity, even a piece of their future." Emma's breath caught. "My future?" He nodded. "It's possible. Only you can truly know." In the days that followed, Emma tried to return to her routine. She helped her family in the bakery, kneading dough and frosting cakes, but everything felt muted. The joy she used to find in her work, the small moments of satisfaction, seemed distant now. She would catch herself staring out the window, her mind drifting to the river and the memories she had reclaimed. At night, she dreamed of the field behind the bakery, the golden light of the sun, and her parents' laughter. The memory played over and over, vivid and unchanging. At first, it comforted her, but soon it began to feel like a weight. It was too perfect, too complete, as though it had been plucked from the flow of time and preserved unnaturally. One evening, Emma returned to the river. The fisher was waiting, as though he had known she would come. He didn't speak as she approached, but the look in his eyes told her he understood. "I can't stop thinking about it," she admitted, sitting beside him. "The memory I took back. It's like it's stuck in my mind, playing on repeat." The fisher nodded slowly. "That's the nature of reclaimed days. They don't flow like the rest of time. They stay fixed, unchanging, perfect, but unnatural. Emma stared at the water, her reflection rippling in the current. And the cost? Will I ever know what I lost? You might, he said, or you might not. Some prices reveal themselves immediately. Others take years to unfold. As the seasons changed, Emma began to notice small cracks in her world. She found herself forgetting things, details about her childhood, the faces of people she had known, even her own ambitions. The bakery, once her refuge, felt suffocating. She began to wonder if the hollow feeling inside her would ever go away. One day, she returned to the river and found the fisher examining another glowing sphere. He held it up to the light, studying the image within. Emma hesitated, then stepped closer. "Is that one mine?" she asked. The fisher shook his head. "No, but it belongs to someone who's running out of time." Emma frowned. "What happens if they don't come for it?" "It fades," he said. "The river can only hold so much. Lost days that aren't reclaimed eventually dissolve, becoming part of the current." Emma shivered at the thought. "And what happens to the people they belong to?" "They move on," he said, "but they're never whole." The fisher's words stayed with Emma. She began to see the river not as a place of wonder, but as a reminder of the fragility of time. She thought of her own choice, the day she had taken back, and the piece of herself she had given up. She wondered if she had made the right decision, or if she should have let the river keep her memory. One night, unable to sleep, she returned to the river for what she knew would be the last time. The fisher was there, as always, his line cast into the shimmering water. He didn't look up as she approached, but his voice was soft when he spoke. "You've come to say goodbye." Emma nodded, her throat tight. "I can't keep coming here. The river. It's taken too much from me." The fisher reeled in his line, his movements slow and deliberate. "You're not the first to feel that way, and you won't be the last." Emma hesitated, then placed a hand on his arm. "You don't have to stay here, you know. You could leave. Start over." He smiled faintly, though the sadness in his eyes didn't fade. "This is my place. The river chose me, just as it chose you. But your path is different. You still have a chance to live." Emma felt tears prick her eyes. "What if I don't know how to move on?" "You will," he said. "The river doesn't let go easily, but neither does time. Keep moving and you'll find your way." As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Emma stood by the river one last time. The fisher watched as she turned to leave, his expression unreadable. She didn't look back, but she felt his presence, steady as the current. The memory she had reclaimed would stay with her, a fragment of time plucked from the flow. But the price she had paid would linger, a reminder of the choices she had made and the things she could never get back. And as she walked away, the river continued to flow, carrying its secrets into the endless currents of time.